Can everyone hear me okay through this? Okay, so so I'm going to talk about basically the explosion in data that the events industry has had over the last 18 months and how better use of that data, the start to employ data science, can actually change the industry for the better, and how we move from just raw statistics to adding in that layer of analytics and higher forms of learning from it. I'm from Expo Platform. Expo Platform, we provide event technology, various different types of event technology, in-person smart events, 365 communities for lots of organisers. So we work with people like Informa, Reeds, Clarion, Comexposium, and all sorts of different scales of events organisers. So I guess one of the main things that's come out of the COVID pandemic has been how events organisers have been forced to accelerate the digital transition. So this is from AMR research saying that pre-pandemic, only about 2% of revenue from the main exhibition organisers came from digital. And the expectation from exhibition leaders is that's going to shift up to being 25%. So that's a huge shift, a massive step change from just 2% to 25% of revenues coming from digital, which has been accelerated obviously by the current pandemic, but also should have happened a long time ago. The exhibition industry in particular has been very slow at adapting. What that means, all of these new platforms, new approaches that have been used, the move to a community approach, the move to doing a mix of hybrid and in-person, is that 20 times the data is now being captured based on what we're seeing within our platform, 20 times the data on participants to what was there before, when all you knew was whether they'd registered or not and if they actually converted and walked through the doors. That's pretty much all you knew about it. Now there's so much more data, so much richer data that's being collected on participants. The problem is, as an industry, we haven't really got our heads around what to do with all of that data yet. So with that in mind, we've been researching this, we've been interviewing lots of CEOs and heads of data at some of the leading organisers. We've also been sending out surveys and studies. And so I'm going to present back some of the findings from that new research and also at Expo Platform, how we're interpreting some of those findings. We spoke to Paul Miller a couple of weeks ago, CEO of Questex, so one of the largest organisers in the world. He said he couldn't sleep by being the CEO of an event company, but being a CEO of a connections company is the place to be. So pure in-person events is probably not the space that people want to be in, but if you can sort of broaden that and say, actually, our core purpose here is to forge connections with people, irrespective of what the platform is, that's one of the sentiments, I think, that's underlying a lot of this research. It's quite a good encapsulation, I think, of what we've been told by the kind of people we've been speaking to. Now, on that sort of statistics versus analytics point, I guess the main point I want to make here is that statistics is the aggregation of some fairly basic metrics, is what, as an industry, we've been used to doing, collecting together a whole smorgasbord of different stats, NPS being obviously top of the hierarchy in the old event statistics model, whereas what we haven't been doing is properly analysing that, having a layer of analytics. So with analytics, you can provide that contextual understanding, start forming hypotheses of what the statistics are telling us. To give you like a real-world example of why that's important, the typical model would be a show would happen, you do your Net Promoter Score surveys, post-event, visitor and exhibitor, and from that it might say NPS is negative, what are we going to do about that? The event hasn't lived up to expectations. The problem with that is, if you take an example of what typical results from an NPS survey might be, there are 200 exhibitors, only 15 of those exhibitors actually answered the survey in the first place, which is completely non-significant and you should probably throw out those kind of results. Now, I don't want to slate NPS as it is, because actually it's a pretty good metric, but one of my issues with it is that it's a lagging metric, so you only really find out after the event's happened, after you can do anything about it. and the sample sizes tend to be far too small. One of the things we're working on is how we can do regular check-ins with NPS, like an ongoing pulse to see how satisfaction is changing throughout the event cycle, throughout the period of the community. But I think that's an example of where statistics aren't necessarily the best measure of what's actually been happening. And overall, as an industry, we need to start to move up the value chain. So if you think about the data science hierarchy of needs, going from collecting that data to thinking about how it's properly stored, and then as you progress and move up, then you can move into analytics, and then ultimately start making assumptions based on that data using machine learning, deep learning, and actually taking action on it. But the starting point, and this is what's really been hard for people to achieve, is collecting that data in a consistent way. And actually I'll come on to it in a second, but from our research, that's the main problem that organisers have right now, is that collection layer. Getting the data foundation right is incredibly important, because then you can't start building your statistical or analytical models on top of that. So as an industry, we need to do this stuff better, and getting your data foundation right has to be the starting point. So as part of the research, we wanted to, rather than as an event tech company just to go and just create our own dashboards based on stuff we thought would be interesting, we interviewed a whole range of organisers to understand the types of questions that are important to them. So what are the types of metrics which are going to drive their business? And here's some of the findings. So initially, we asked, what are the greatest opportunities for data and analytics to improve your events business in the year ahead? And right at the top, so number one, well, actually, there's two points in pole position. The first is customer insights to help to shape product development. So NPS, going back to that, isn't actually particularly great at giving you anything meaningful to shape your overall value proposition. So what are those types of customer insights? Now we're getting 20 times the level of data. How can that really shape product development? And then right up at the top also is the personalization of online experiences. So now we're collecting all of that data. How are we using that to make, rather than just like one large-scale website or one large-scale event, which is generic for everyone, how can you take that data and in real time personalize it so it becomes a much more relevant, more focused micro experience rather than just being something which is generic to everyone? The next things which were coming up were collecting together the data sources, making sure it's a seamless experience across the customer journey. Those are some of the harder issues that people want to solve. And then it goes down through to bottom of the list is actually, which is quite reassuring, is finding new ways to actually sell that data onto exhibitors. So right at the top then, customer insights to shape product development and personalization of online experience. We also asked, incidentally, about the personalization of event agendas, and interestingly, that does seem to be coming in, still important, but that does seem to be coming in second place to the actual online experience. So then, and by the way, we are going to publish our AI blueprint in the next couple of weeks, and that's going to go much more into detail on all of these findings, showing all of the different metrics people were talking to us about. But as an overview, here are the main categories of metrics which organisers want to focus on. So NPS, old faithful NPS, is still there. And again, the ever quotable Paul Miller, one of the things he said was that in his fantasy dashboard, NPS would always be your top right metric, and it's still there, it's still relevant. Hey, I don't know who that cow is. But far higher up the tree than NPS is return on investment and real business done. So how can we really drill into what's happening in terms of those connections, and how can we start to put a figure on the actual business, the meetings, the valuable connections which are happening across the show floor and in advance. Return on time came up, return on investment, and actually finding ways to track business done. Then next, one of the biggest asks was for ways to measure that entire customer experience, which can be problematic if you're using a variety of different vendors. So if you've got webinars on one platform, a different media site, a different directory platform, another virtual event platform, another registration platform, before you know it, you've got 6 or 7 different data sources, makes doing that measurement across the whole customer journey really difficult. So one of the things we're focusing on is how we sort of join up all those different data points into a single view of the customer. Here's an example of something which we're developing at the moment in response to these findings. So that critical piece about customer insights to shape product development, we're looking at different ways that we can cut all of that data to highlight some of the trends, some of the different things which, when you dig below the surface, what's happening within your community, within your event. This example here is the types of connections, leads being generated, stuff that's happening within the marketplace, or within the exhibitors, how you're connecting buyers and sellers. And one of the things I wanted to focus on is, excuse me, this part of the dashboard, which is finding ways to track and measure supply and demand. And so we are, on platforms like ours, we're collecting lots of really in-depth insight into the visitor interest. So not just the visitor interest captured at registration, but how after the registration that index is moving up and down based on the types of articles they're looking at, the type of products, the types of searches, connecting together all those different data points to understand which are the product categories that visitors are interested in. On this axis, we can filter that by how many products do we have within our marketplace, how many exhibitors do we have within that marketplace, and from that you start being able to map supply and demand. So bottom right quadrant is low demand from your visitors but high supply. So this might indicate you've got too many exhibitors in this particular category and not enough visitors to match it. Whereas top left, which is high demand, low supply, this could be really interesting in terms of your sales team and saying we've got a captive audience here, we've got high demand for a particular product category but not enough exhibitors. And the way we're setting up these dashboards is that you can create customer segments, you can filter it by different personas, so you can start seeing how supply and demand is shifting within your network. So that's one example of the types of customer insights you can do to shape product development. Exactly the same in terms of content. If you're able to track the articles, the sessions, the webinars, the ebooks people are looking at by product category, then you can start seeing the same kind of stuff. So is there some trending content within my industry? And if this topic's becoming more interesting, maybe there's a webinar in that, maybe there's an event in that, or something else to spin off. So trying to see these like early warning signs, if you like, about what's happening within your industry so that you can then inform your next product development. So much more impactful, we believe, than a lagging metric like NPS. We can start to, as you interrogate the data, trying to work out who is the perfect buyer for your exhibitors. So that could be done, of course, based on demographics, so things like job title, industry, company size, budget, etc., but also looking at what are those signals showing that there's intent to purchase. So that could be the online behavior, the type of content they're looking at, what they're actively researching. And then once you've identified that segment, then how do you take action on it? So identification and action really have to coexist either within the same system or within the same data structure. The type of action you could take, if you've identified someone who would be a perfect buyer, that could trigger a hosted buyer program, which could be pre-show, post-show, during the show, request for proposals, RFPs and tenders, various triggers for content. So if you've got someone who matches that perfect buyer persona, then you might want to send them vendor comparisons, checklists, and have those kind of automated triggers. And for exhibitors themselves, highlighting those leads within their dashboards. At the moment, most people would see those leads as being equal, rather than saying, well, these are the ones that your team really needs to focus on. These are the hottest leads, these are your MQLs to SQLs and have real intent to purchase. So we think this is an incredibly powerful persona group which you can build to segment your data with. Something else which has come up in the survey is the need for better metrics for ROI for your exhibitors. And so here's an example of how you can do that. So by bringing together all of these data points into one dashboard, you start seeing much more than just this person is a scan on your stand. So one of the things we're focused on is this is our new Exhibitor Roi Dashboard, which connects together connections which were made online ahead of the show, views of suppliers' online profiles, the content that they're looking at, products, webinars, interactions with advertising, interactions with pop-ups, as well as in-person badge scans. So rather than it just being a flat, here are the people who you scanned at your stand, bringing together all of those data points so that you can start seeing, start having lead scoring, which is what this is. So being able to score those leads based on all of those different interactions and offer that in real time. Then one of those other points which came up high in the survey were how to personalize online event experiences. And the way we believe is the best way to do that is through person-to-object AI recommendations. So rather than AI recommendations being limited to matching person to person, person-to-object means that all of these different data points can all come together into one user's profile. So the articles, the sessions, the people, the products, the exhibitors that they're looking at, all of this starts with registration, but very quickly that should get overtaken by their real behavior, the different things they're interacting with, and peer interests and behaviors. I've got a lot to get through, so I am trying to talk through this quite fast. But if you want to talk about any of this afterwards, we can. So, in the survey then, we asked our panel of experts for their advice as to how to get started with this. So how are some of the ways that organisers want to start to achieve this? So the greatest challenge that came through, and this is approaching half of all responses we had, was that the greatest challenge everyone faces is getting that foundation right. So collecting and connecting different data sources is far and away the biggest challenge. And it's something which we have to grapple with every day is integrations and integrating with various different people, trying to pull together all those different data sources makes everything incredibly hard. And the more vendors you have, the harder it gets. Second was a lack of organisational maturity. And this came across from organisers big and small, who say that there's, for whatever reason, data isn't high enough on the board agendas. There are some who are doing some interesting things with this. Probably worth shouting out Informa, who have just created an entirely new data division, which in itself is ambitious, and they've completely separated that out as part of divisional responsibility from all of the business units, and do seem to be approaching it in a very strategic way. But generally, the feedback is that organisations, large and small, aren't taking this seriously enough. And then the challenge is getting meaningful insights from that data. But before we even get to that point, it's about connecting together all of those disparate data sources. So here are some of the, I guess some of the advice which we've sort of managed to draw out from the survey. So the first is around, well, the first step to getting that data foundation right is to take control of your data. It sounds obvious, but it's not the same across every vendor, so well worth checking the T's and C's in your contract. But a massive 97% of people who answered the survey, so basically everybody, said that it's very important or of greatest importance that organisers retain full and exclusive control of their user data. It's a kind of obvious point, but as I say, it is very, very different data policies between the different technology vendors. So well worth reading the contracts and making sure that you have that control, because if you don't have control of your own data, you aren't able to do any of these higher level things. And generally, there are two different models. There's the organizer-led control model, which is where you as the organizer have complete control of your data and the vendor is a processor, working in the same way as a registration company. We process it and that's it and give it back to you. And then there's the vendor-led data control model. So it's worth being aware of the differences between those different models. We've published our data manifesto a while ago, expoplatform.com/data manifesto, if you want to read more about those two different approaches. Consolidating platforms, if you're able to, is a very sensible idea. I mean, this quote from our research, I think really to me sums up a lot of this. So our greatest challenge is a federated corporate structure, so different business units going off and doing their own thing, meaning it's really hard to make any of this work. So integrating different data sets, formats and structures from different systems, if you're doing that, it makes it really difficult. So this is on the right, this is the way that we work at Expo Platform. Our whole setup is that on one single data platform, we're able to give you various different modules so that you can build some of these experiences the way you want to build them. So it can include registration, hosted buying, event website, 365 community. You don't necessarily need to, unless you wanted to, and we can integrate, but if you don't need to have to go out to sort of build your Frankenstein's monster of event technology. Where possible, and it's not always possible, but wherever possible, to try to standardize around one or two vendors, make sure those integrations really work well for you, is very sensible. And also don't change supplier every 12 months. You're just making life so much harder for yourself when you do that. We're one of the founding partners of the VSEF initiative. There are other data standardization initiatives at the moment, but we think that's a really positive step forward from the industry, so that even if you are using lots of different vendors, at least they're standardizing their data in a similar format. So I think look for people who are VSEF compliant where possible. A useful approach with this, I think, and it's a good way actually to secure that organizational buy-in, but is to approach all of this in terms of minimum viable products. So rather than assuming that you can just pick another vendor off and immediately go from like 0 to 60 in 12 weeks, it's about a more of a strategic view, starting off with your minimum viable product, get that working well for you first, and then looking at what's next and what the roadmap is. That's quite alien, I think, for the way that events generally works within event cycles. But as much as possible, the longer term partnerships and relationships are the ones that tend to work. So I guess some advice on that is to try to, once you've got your first iteration out of the way, then you can start to dig into the data, spot where the improvements are, and gradually make improvements, measure the results, and iterate over a longer period of time. That's the way to have a fruitful vendor-organizer relationship. An example of that from last year, I was working at Informa last year. I was launching lots of digital events. One of those was a big pharmaceutical event, and the brand director was absolutely adamant that it had to have meetings of 20 people plus, and so that this is the way that our event works, and if you don't have 20 people in the meeting, it's not going to work for us. And so we had to actually delay the launch of the digital platform by a couple of weeks before our vendor developed that in. After the show, we went back to look at the data, and 0.5% of people had more than 5 people in a meeting. So that's just one example of where, you know, assumptions can get in the way of everything else. And so starting off with your basic MVP, looking at what the data is showing you, and then making improvements is a more sensible basis for iterations. And then, assuming you've got those building blocks in place, we asked our panel of organisers about whether they're building teams whether they're building data science teams to start to derive meaning from it. Only 40% said that they already have an existing team in it or are actively recruiting for it. Another 40% said they had no plans to do it at all. The remaining 20% said they are thinking about it for the next sort of years ahead. I think that kind of speaks to the level of sophistication and, again, organisational buy-in at this point. But like going back to what I was saying before, unless you get the foundation right, unless you get those data sources pulling in a consistent, standardized way, you can't do this anyway. So getting those building blocks in place is the important stuff. We're going to be publishing this research very soon as part of what I think we're going to call the data science blueprint. Or something like that. It'll be a blueprint. I mean, you can tell they're all one blueprint or another. We've published the monetization blueprint, the hybrid blueprint, and the marketplace blueprint. They're all about 40 to 50 page ebooks, which are like doing similar research projects, interviewing experts to get advice on how to do some of this. If you go to expoplatform.com ebooks, then you can download this and the data ebook, which we'll be launching in the next 2 weeks. That's it from me. We're just around the corner, so if you want to talk to us after this, please do. All right, thanks for your time. If you've got any questions, do we have time for questions?
Oh, yeah, we do have time, but before we do that, I think a round of applause for Luke. Thank you.
All right, thank you.
That was information central.
Yeah.
I don't think, Henry, any on the... No, nothing through the website. Does anyone want to use their human mouth and ask a question? No? Okay, well, I've got a quick question based on the last session as well. I think my issue is like I get paralysis from the analytics that we get from our events and therefore just don't use it probably at all. Or, what's the best way to deal with that?
Yeah, I think it is, this would be my... This I think is really interesting. So last time I counted, at Informa we were tracking 80 different metrics from bounce rates, conversion rate, the whole lot. And you're right. It's really hard to do anything from all of that data. So I think the starting point is to say what actually matters for the event you're in and for your community. So an example of that, and it's, sorry, I keep going back to Informa, but it's an Informa event called Roots. So World Roots is an event which has been very successful for years based on their meeting program. So it's about airlines and airports meeting each other in like a speed networking kind of environment. Lots and lots of 20-minute slots. They get through thousands of these meetings a day. It's a really impressive operation. And what we managed to do with that event was we had about 5 years worth of meeting data, and we were able to correlate that with the new airline routes which were announced over that period. And what we discovered from that was about 30% of airports and airlines who met each other, so Virgin Airways meeting with Heathrow or Las Vegas, 30% of the people who met at routes, they announced a new route together over that time period. Now, what we couldn't tell was whether that was correlation or causation, but we just know that, that there was a correlation there. Now, that is incredibly powerful data, and that's fundamental to why that event exists. That event exists to power aviation, and we could prove that there's a 30% correlation between what our event did and the industry overall, which is kind of like a golden metric. So I guess it would be to do that. It's like, what's your event? Why does your event exist? And in most cases, it's about actually doing business. So if you can get to that, that's far more important than your other, 89 different data points.
Really interesting stuff. Thank you one more time, Luke.
All right.
Nice to meet you, mate. Well done. That was great. We're back here in 15 minutes.
Yep.
I cannot remember what the session is, but I hope you join us.